All right, now we're going to look at the energy needs of a muscle. I've talked about this already, but I want to talk about kind of where the sources are. So we have our myosin ATPase, that's the myosin head, right? So this is going to use 70% of the ATP that the muscle uses. Restoring the pump back to, or restoring the calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum uses the other 30%. So by the way, I will specify that this is to cycle between power stroke and to break rigor state. Both of those factor into that 70%. So when we're at rest or just using mild exercise, we still have some of those myosin cross bridges forming. It's just very low level. And so usually we're just fine getting ATP through aerobic respiration, okay? And we can use that. So aerobic respiration is another thing for it. It's essentially combining the respiratory system and cellular respiration both. Mild exercise, so we exercise our heart rates up, but it's not beating super fast. We can accomplish our goal through this aerobic respiration. We're going to we're going to burn glucose, but at mild levels of exercise, we actually can tap into those fatty acids, so our fat reserves. And so the current theory or leading theory, and everything's subject to change as more data comes in, but the leading idea is that mild exercise is actually better for burning fat, because the slowness of the exercise allows for us to metabolize that fat. It takes some time to do that. But as we increase our rates, so we're going to start to pull from our glycogen stores. And we're going to release glycogen stores, means we're going to take our glycogen, and thanks to the liver and the skeletal muscles, remember glycogen is found both in liver and skeletal muscles, we're going to convert that into glucose and use that. And then heavy exercises will pull from our blood glucose. We want to be careful with this because we need to maintain homeostasis. Okay. We don't necessarily maintain homeostasis with glycogen stores per se. We can deplete those glycogen stores completely. We store as much as we have room for, and then we're capable of depleting those during times of fasting or intense and prolonged exercise. Fat, we will draw down that fat. At some point we start to experience serious health problems due to not having enough of a fat reserve, so we do need some of it, but most of us have plenty of fat to draw down. And again, we're not worried about maintaining homeostasis. It's not like we're worrying about having X number of pounds of fat, mostly, as long as we're higher than the minimum amount that we need. Okay. And so you can get different types of storage or energy stores that are used for different types of exercises. Now, one of the cool things about exercise is so most of the time we rely on our chemical insulin, this is a hormone, to regulate glucose transporters, so abbreviated GLUT. And those glucose transporters allow for the cell to absorb glucose, which is necessary for us to use it. But skeletal muscle activity can also cause the insertion of a different type of glucose transporter called the GLUT4 channel. Okay, and this one is insulin independent. Or actually, it can be modified by insulin, but the insertion of this in exercise is independent of insulin. And it is the process of exercising by itself that causes this GLUT4 channel to be inserted into the sarcolemma so that it can absorb more glucose from the cell. This is actually kind of cool and also has implications for people who are diabetic. One thing that they can do when their blood glucose levels are too high, they can of course take more of their medication and so forth, but sometimes just going out for a very brisk walk or run will also help bring their blood glucose levels down, because the muscles absorb it through that GLUT4 transporter. Oxygen, of course, as we already know, is required for cellular respiration to produce ATP. We have limited capacity. I mean, we're pretty good about taking oxygen out of the atmosphere and into our blood and using that oxygen by the cells to produce ATP. But we do have a maximal capacity, okay? So each of us have a maximal ability to take up oxygen. And that maximal ability depends on a number of factors. We can condition ourselves, so as we exercise, we get better at it. Aerobic exercise in particular, we get better at it. We increase our aerobic capacity, etc. Some of it's genetics as well. But eventually we'll reach a point where we've got maximum oxygen uptake. Now, depending on the intensity of our workout, we will use cellular respiration primarily to produce the ATP, but about 50 to 70%, once we're at about 50 to 70% of our aerobic capacity, our maximum ability to use oxygen, we start to burn lactic acid. And this fits back into what we were talking about in cellular respiration, where I said that the lactic acid pathway, would be helpful if I spelled that right, the lactic acid pathway can occur at the same time to cellular respiration. And so that's important to know. And that starts to happen about 50 to 70% of your aerobic capacity. And this actually is where, you know, I don't know if you've watched the old videos where people were always talking about feeling the burn. They're talking about that lactic acid and other acids produced by the working skeletal muscles. And the higher your heart rate, the higher your respiratory rate, the more likely you are to feel that build up. When you stop exercising, okay, when you stop exercising, especially if you're doing more than just mild exercise, you build up this oxygen debt. And that oxygen debt is why you continue to breathe hard even after you stop. So you imagine you're running, you're out for a long run. It takes a few minutes before your respiratory rate returns to normal. And it's because you're repaying the oxygen debt. What do you do when you repay the oxygen debt? Well, you're adding more oxygen back to hemoglobin, and you're adding more oxygen to the myoglobin, because your skeletal muscles use oxygen in both stores when we're not getting enough from respiration. Okay. Myoglobin is a muscle found in, as you recall from earlier, is a protein found in skeletal muscle that works a lot like hemoglobin. We talked about phosphocreatine in lab, so I'm only going to be brief about this, but this is a way to store ATP. Remember, ATP doesn't have a very long shelf life, and so if we want to be able to store it, we can't just make a crap ton of ATP and leave it sitting in the cytosol. It doesn't work. So to store it, we have to take that ATP, add it to the chemical creatine, creating a molecule called phosphocreatine. We produce ADP and creatine plus a phosphate attached to it, so the phosphocreatine. And then when we need that ATP back, we're going to take our ADP, it's going to chemically react with the phosphocreatine, and we're going to produce ATP, and we now use that for muscle contraction. So creatine is a way to store that ATP in skeletal muscle. We produce it, or we can obtain it from our diet. Now, our muscle fibers in general can be divided into 3 different types of muscles. So slow twitch and fast twitch fibers, and then an intermediate fiber that is in between. Our slow twitch muscles are used for endurance. Okay, these are usually very richly supplied with capillaries. They have a lot more mitochondria than the other types. They have more respiratory enzymes, meaning more of the enzymes that are involved in cellular respiration. They're also packed with myoglobin, which gives them the dark red appearance. Okay, a dark red appearance. Importantly, they contract slower. Okay, that's why they're actually called slow twitch muscles. But they're said to have a high oxidative capacity because they are capable of using that oxygen for oxidation reduction reactions to produce the ATP. They're also known as slow oxidative fibers instead of just slow twitch. These type of muscles are found in postural muscles. Some of us also, of course, have them in many of our major muscles. Endurance runners, for example, have a high abundance of slow twitch muscles. Our type 2 or fast twitch muscles, these are very fast, but they fatigue quickly. By the way, we also call slow twitch muscles fatigue resistant. Fast twitch muscles fatigue very quickly. We have two different types. We've got a type 2B and a type 2A. The type 2B fatigues fast, fewer capillaries, fewer mitochondria, fewer respiratory enzymes, less myoglobin, and therefore they are more pale in color. Those of you who are meat eaters, the turkey that we eat at Thanksgiving has dark meat and light meat. The dark meat is your slow twitch muscles and the light meat is your fast twitch muscles. Now, fast twitch muscles tend to have more glycogen stores, and this is because they actually wouldn't use the glycogen stores per se while contracting. They tend to be used by sprinters, okay, for maintaining sprinters, people who use short bursts of speed or so forth would use these fast twitch muscles. But they use the glycogen stores to quickly restore their supply of ATP, generally in between uses. And so they are often called glycolytic fibers. These muscles are stronger and they contract faster. So that's important. And we tend to use these not just for sprinting, but also like weightlifting. Things like that which would require a very strong and fast burst of speed. The intermediate fibers are fast twitch, but they actually have a high oxidative capacity, which means they can actually generate ATP fairly quickly. Now, importantly or interestingly, we tend to be born with a certain amount of slow twitch and a certain amount of fast twitch fibers. It's controlled mostly by our genetics. Somebody who is naturally a very good sprinter usually has a hard time with endurance exercises, and while there is some ability to train these muscles, particularly some of the fast twitch muscles can be trained to have better oxidative capacity, and to some extent an Olympic sprinter will never be an Olympic endurance runner. It's just there's not enough crossover, and the ability to train these muscles is not great enough to compensate for natural born genetic tendencies. That's for the Olympic athletes. For the rest of us, we can generally train, you can train yourself to have greater endurance to some degree. Although it's hard, and of course as you work out and you lift weight, it's hard to train yourself, though it's hard to become a really fast sprinter if you're somebody who does endurance running. But there's more wiggle room as long as we're not trying to win the Olympics. Last topic I want to talk about is muscle fatigue. And I've mentioned this already, but I want to get into the molecular causes for this. There's several different types of causes. Remember, when muscles are contracting rapidly, we're generating action potentials, and part of action potentials is for those potassium channels to open, allowing potassium to exit the cell. Eventually, if we have enough activity, we will end up reducing the membrane potential because we end up with potassium accumulating outside the cell. Probably important to note that we'll also have some sodium accumulating inside the cell as well. And so as the membrane potential is changed and reduced, our resting membrane potential would change. Remember that the resting membrane potential for muscles is about 85 to 90 millivolts, which is the equilibrium potential for potassium. And so if we end up creeping up to say -70 millivolts, our ability to contract and generate action potentials decreases. And so we actually end up... I said that backwards, didn't I? Yep, I totally said that backwards. By reducing the membrane potential, we would actually be creeping from 85 to minus 90, making it harder for us to generate action potential. So reducing means making more negative. All right, making the membrane potential more negative. And that actually makes sense because as potassium accumulates in the extracellular fluid, then we're leaving behind those proteins and those phosphates that are negatively charged. Hey. We deplete glycogen stores. That tends to take a while. It usually takes about 2 to 3 hours of hard work. People who are running marathons often have problems here. People who are working all day long might have problems with glycogen being depleted, but the average person going out for a 30-minute run is not going to deplete their glycogen stores. Calcium. If we reduce the calcium in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, we're not going to be able to generate contraction very easily. And this does happen because some of the calcium will actually leak out of the cell through channels in the plasma membrane. Lactic acid accumulation lowers the pH, but I'll also point out, I should have written this in a separate line probably, but carbon dioxide production combining with water to produce that hydrogen ion, and the bicarbonate ion also lowers the pH. And so that's important because where's the carbon dioxide coming from? It's coming from cellular respiration. As phosphocreatine breaks down, we're going to be producing more inorganic phosphate. That's this thing right here. And so that's means it is problematic because we're left with ADP and inorganic phosphate, which is not ATP. And so we end up with, consequently, if we can't keep up with the energy needs, we're going to end up with a decrease in ATP and an increase in ADP. And then the last type of fatigue usually takes some long days, lots of hard work, lots of intense workout, but it's to get what is called central fatigue, and that's with the neurons. It doesn't happen very quickly. It doesn't happen very often. It's not a common response, but it can happen. And it's relatively dangerous when it happens. Imagine, for example, you're lifting weights and you've been pushing yourself really, really hard, and suddenly the central nervous system is no longer sending action potentials to your skeletal muscles. It's not like tetanus where you have some warning. So remember, with tetanus, you build it up, and then your fatigue eventually gradually slowly decreases, and you can be like, oh crap, I'm out of strength, I need to put this barbell on the rack, and instead it just completely drops. So you're contracting, and then boom, there's nothing there, and you end up dropping the barbell and really hurting yourself. So while it's fairly uncommon, when it does happen, it's usually bad news. And that should be it. I probably should record this slide because I screwed this one up, but I need to move on. So I apologize for screwing that part up. I want to make it clear that when we increase the amount of extracellular calcium, we are reducing membrane potential, meaning making it more negative, which means we're leaving behind unopposed negative proteins and phosphates, and we're changing our resting membrane potential from, say, minus 85 to minus 90. I think that's it. All right, guys. Sorry this one's long. Good luck as you study.